Morning, everyone. Today we start with chapter 2, and of course this is the chapter where we get to meet Dorian Gray in person. As you will have seen from the note that I sent to you last night, it's really important that you track the transition that takes place in Dorian Gray from the beginning to the end of this chapter. And as I indicated, you might want to make a quote summary for yourselves to track that transition. So as always, Dorian is highlighted in blue, and he will, you can use quotes from those highlights to track that transition that takes place in him. The other useful thing that you may want to do as well in this chapter is have a look at how diction is used. So from time to time we are going to stop today and have a look a little bit at diction and how you would use it when you were answering a contextual question. So remember that chapter 1 ends with the announcement of the arrival of Dorian Gray and Basil's plea to Henry not to spoil him, to leave him alone, essentially. And of course, I am assuming that you have read the chapter and you know that that is very far from Henry's thinking in terms of leaving him alone. So we're going to have a look at the very first thing we learn about Dorian is that he is seated at the piano. And we hear his interest in music. He's clearly very well versed in music. Again, your upper classes would have had that sort of teaching and training. They would have learned how to play instruments and so forth because that was part of their privilege. Basil rather then goes on to ask him to sit so that he can continue with the portrait, and we get our very first impression of Dorian Gray, and he says, "Oh, I'm tired of sitting, and I don't want a life-sized portrait of myself," answered the lad. And the description of the way in which he answers is in a willful, petulant manner. So first things first, let's look at the whole idea of what comes across about him. You may have reacted as you were reading to that response, but there's almost the kind of spoilt brat in him. You know, he's tired of sitting, he's petulant, he's willful, almost as if he's having a tantrum. So if you were asked a question in terms of diction about the use of the word willful and petulant, that's the sort of thing that you want to explore. When we talk about a petulant child, we're talking about that child who stamps their foot and shouts and cries and protests and refuses to do what they have been told. Any of you who have nieces or nephews or maybe younger siblings who are around about 2 or 3 or even 4 years old, you will have seen that petulant behavior in them. So that's our first introduction to Dorian Gray himself, that he comes across as being petulant. And then, of course, we see Henry. And a couple of paragraphs down, Henry says, "You have not spoiled my pleasure in meeting you, Mr. Gray." Now, if we're going to pick up again on the teaching of on handling a contextual, this would be a lovely question to ask on tone. What would the tone of Henry be in that line when he says, "You have not spoiled my pleasure in meeting you"? Given what we have learnt about Henry in the previous chapter, we've spoken about him as the predator. His curiosity is piqued when Basil speaks about Dorian Gray. And here we have him, the idea that this is a pleasure. What is the tone, do you think, of Henry when he says that? Is it almost a kind of anticipation of what he's going to find in Dorian Gray? Is it apologetic? I'm not convinced it is. I think it's more this anticipation of what he's going to discover about the character of Dorian Gray. That quote is found at the top of page 23. You will see today I'm using a different app that I've downloaded just to try and reduce some of the labor intensity of these exercises. If it really doesn't work for you, let me know, but I'm hoping that all the slides are clear to you. Then Henry steps back and he observes Dorian. And it's about halfway down page 23. It says, Lord Henry looked at him. Yes, he was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp gold hair. Now that's important because the Victorian ideal body image was this. It was the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the more pale and porcelain a person's skin, the more handsome or beautiful they were considered. The scarlet lips, so what is known as the peaches and cream complexion, that was the ideal body image of the Victorian era. So, the 20th and 21st centuries tend to focus in men on the more rugged good looks, whereas the Victorian era would have focused on this almost feminine description that's given on Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is a pretty boy. He's got these fine porcelain features, youthful look, which is really important, of course, as we learn later on in the chapter. And so he continues, there was something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candor of youth was there, as well as all youth's passionate purity. One felt that he had kept himself unspotted from the world. No wonder Basil Hallward worshipped him. Now it's important, I mentioned in a previous lesson, there seems to be this charismatic quality about Dorian Gray that attracts people to him, and the sense that they can trust him. He seems to be a very engaging character. He's got an allure about him that appeals to people. And of course, coupled with that, his good looks. Now, in a society that focuses on the superficial and on external appearance, this is what enables Dorian Gray to pursue the life that he does later on in the novel, because everybody would judge him by his appearance, his beauty. And those of you who have read further in the novel and have finished the novel will know that Henry actually says to Dorian, you are too beautiful to do evil. So it's really important. This physical description we have of Dorian is an important description. Basil, in the meantime, is getting ready to get on with his painting, and he's listening to the conversation. And of course, he is very concerned about where this conversation is going between Dorian and Henry. And so we have the comment at the bottom of page 23. It's the second last paragraph. He was looking worried, and when he heard Lord Henry's last remark, he glanced at him, hesitated for a moment, and then said, Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it awfully rude of me if I asked you to go away? He wants to get rid of Henry because he's afraid of the influence that he may have. Now, you will see in the paragraph above that on my slide, I've highlighted philanthropy, just to explain it to you. So philanthropy was really the doing of good deeds or charitable works. That is how Dorian Gray and Henry's aunt, Lady Agatha, have connected when he was supposed to have played the duet with her in the East End. It would have been at some sort of charity function that he would have played. The East End of London was where the poorest of the poor lived. It was a very impoverished area. In fact, it still is in London if you go to the East End. And so that's the reference to the philanthropy. And of course, we see Henry's attitude where he is dismissive. He says, well, you're too good looking, you're too handsome to be involved in philanthropy, because Henry is not interested in that. Henry's attitude to your poorer class is absolutely derogatory. He despises them, he's got no time for them, and he really doesn't care whether they live or die. And then we pick it up, another comment that we have about Dorian. And if you're making a quote summary, this is another important one just to note down so that you can track Dorian through this chapter, where there's this conversation about Henry leaving. And Henry, of course, doesn't want to go because he's now picked up the scent of the prey, and he wants to pursue this conversation with Dorian. Dorian doesn't want him to go because there seems to be this instant connection between Dorian Gray and Lord Henry. They seem to connect, and we'll talk about that connection as the chapter develops. And so Dorian says, Henry asks Basil to stay, and Basil replies, and he says, if Dorian wishes it, of course you must stay. Dorian's whims are laws to everybody except himself. And that quote is the third paragraph on page 24 in your texts. Another one later on, there's still the debate about whether Henry leaves or not, and Dorian's response, look at the attitude in Dorian again. Basil, cried Dorian Gray, if Lord Henry Wotton goes, I shall go too. So there's again that petulance about him that we see right at the opening of the chapter, this idea that he behaves like a spoilt child, and he demands attention, and he makes demands that of course Basil then gives into. Basil capitulates, but he makes a statement, and this statement needs to go onto your character page for Lord Henry. It's one of the most important quotes about him. It's the bottom of page 24, the end of the second last paragraph, and he gives Dorian a warning, and he says to him, he has a very bad influence over all his friends, with the single exception of myself. And we've commented on the idea that Basil is not taken in by Henry. He doesn't get influenced by Henry, but he is very aware of the bad influence of Henry. Another comment that we see about Dorian, at the bottom of page 24, it says, Dorian Gray stepped up on the dais with the air of a young Greek martyr and made a little mew of discontent to Lord Henry, to whom he had rather taken a fancy. So there's the connection that's indicated to us, but also again this spoiled child. He's petulant, and he huffs up onto the thing and sits down as if this is really a time of great suffering for him. And then he's curious. So it's interesting to note that Dorian is as curious about Henry as Henry is about him. And so he says to him on page 25, is Basil is Henry rather really a bad influence? Are you as bad as Basil suggests you are? And this is another really, really important quote. It's the second paragraph on page 25. It reveals again Henry's attitude to life, his philosophy, if you like, of life. He says, "There is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Gray. All influence is immoral. Immoral from the scientific point of view." And he goes on to explain. He says, "Because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him." Now, I want you just to think for a moment where you might have had a friend who gets in with the wrong crowd, and you watch your friend change, and they take on the attitude of the person whose influence they've come under. They start to speak like them. They start to act like them. They start to dress like them. And there's what Henry is referring to, the idea that to influence someone is to give them one's own soul, where the other person starts almost to mimic unquestioningly what their friend, the person who's exerting the peer pressure on them, puts on them. And you may have lost friends over such things where you've eventually just said, "I can't do this anymore. You're not the person you used to be. I don't know you anymore," because they've fallen under the influence of someone else. As I mentioned in a previous lesson, there is this theory that manipulation is a form of evil when you are able to mold someone to your desires, to your thinking, to your influence. You take away their soul and you impose your soul upon them. So I want to just pause and thank those of you who posted some ideas about the soul onto the chat group, because here you see the concept of the soul coming in. And it's really important that you've done some thinking. What is the soul? What does Henry mean when he says you impose your soul onto someone else? Is it spiritual? Is it moral? Is it the person who you really are? And I want to just go back and go through some of the ideas that some of you put forward when you spoke about the soul. So I want to, sorry, I'm just finding them on my phone. So some of you said, for example, it is believed to be part of a religious belief. Now, I'm not sure that Henry sees the soul as a religious entity, because he is effectively completely against religion. We've seen that already a couple of times. But a lot of you mentioned the idea of the soul being the essence of who we are, that the soul is that unique part of ourselves. And that's important, because I think that's what Henry is referring to when he suggests that to influence someone is to impose one's soul on them. You take away their opportunity to be unique. And there's something ironic about it, because he says to Dorian that there is no such thing as a good influence. He knows that he's a bad influence. But because he's amoral, he doesn't see anything wrong with that. He doesn't see anything wrong with imposing his soul on another and manipulating them, because that's what he does. He sees people as entertainment. And I think he senses in Dorian immediately that he can be manipulated, that Dorian is almost ripe for the picking, and that he can make Dorian who he wants him to be. Right, we carry on a little bit further down the page. I want to carry on from where I left off there. He says, the aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. And then a few lines further down, about 4 lines down, he says, the terror of society, which is the basis of morals. Sorry, I've just lost my place a moment. I'm going to start again. The terror of society, which is the basis of morals. The terror of God, which is the secret of religion. These are the two things that govern us. So there again is his take on religion. The idea that religion has been instituted in order to make people fearful. We saw that in chapter 1 as well, that he says conscience and cowardice are the same thing. One is just the name of the other. This idea that he implies that religions has been created to force people to be afraid of themselves and to be afraid of seeking new things. And so he says that's the basis of morals, that morals are only created out of fear. They are not created out of a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Now, interestingly, unconsciously, there is a reaction to this from Dorian Gray, and Basil picks it up. In the next paragraph, so we sort of about 2/3 of the way down page 25 now, Basil says, just turn your head a little more to the right, Dorian, like a good boy, said the painter deep in his work, and conscious only that a look had come into the lad's face that he had never seen there before. Now there's this sense here that there's this beginning of an awakening in Dorian, that Henry has triggered something in him, and we'll explore that in the next lesson. But it's really important, if you're making a quote summary of the transition that takes place from this petulant boy that we meet at the beginning of the chapter to the end, here's the beginning of the turn, the beginning of the change that overcomes Dorian as the chapter progresses. In the next paragraph, there's just an interesting description, a physical description of Lord Henry. We haven't really had a physical description of him, or Basil for that matter, but he's described as having a low musical voice and the graceful wave of the hand, and that attracts Dorian to him. He's fascinated by that, this musical quality of Henry, almost as if Henry draws him in with his voice, and he's able to manipulate him like that. Henry continues with his philosophy. So if you want to have a summary of Henry's philosophy of life, it is in this conversation, this part of this conversation, page 25 and 26, where you get it. He says, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression, to every thought, reality, to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal. Now, the Hellenic ideal refers to a period in ancient Greek history. It runs more or less from 323 BC to 31 BC. And the Hellenic ideal was the Greek fascination or the pursuit of the arts, and that would be all of the arts, music, painting, sculpture, theatre was very important to the ancient Greeks. And in addition to that, a pursuit of mathematical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and philosophy. So that's the Hellenic ideal that Henry is referring to here. But interestingly enough, The Hellenic ideal, that period in Greek history, was also regarded to be a period of decadence and moral degeneration, which actually culminated or ended in the end of the Greek civilization as the top civilization in the world, and the Greeks were then defeated by the Romans. But it's interesting that for him, this is the ideal, a period in ancient Greek history that had the pursuit of all of these things, but it was also decadent and morally degraded. And so he continues about 3 or 4 lines down, and he says, every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once and has done with its sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of regret. The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself. There's hedonism. The idea that if we don't pursue the sensory experience, if we don't pursue pleasure and give in to our temptations, we will be poisoned by it. And there's a very, very important quote that we're going to look at in the next lesson that sums that all up. But that is hedonism. And there is Henry's philosophy very clear to us. And then he continues and he says to Dorian, and we are picking up at towards the end of that very long paragraph on page 26. He says to him, you, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. And Dorian reacted, said, stop, faltered Dorian Gray, stop, you bewilder me. Now, there is a theory that a sociopath or a psychopath can lie dormant within a person, that quality within them can lie dormant, but that if it is triggered, it will grow into sociopathy. And it's quite interesting, the way that Dorian reacts to Henry here, this idea that Henry draws him out, and he says, you know you've had these passions. You've just repressed them, but you know you've had them. And Dorian's reaction, no, stop, this is confusing, I don't like it, which suggests that Henry has hit a nerve in Dorian. In our next lesson, we're going to explore that. So again, it's important, this idea that Henry triggers Dorian at this point, and he sees that he's triggered him, and he then goes on to pursue it. So we'll pick that up tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.